Just give a few seconds for people to log on. All right. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Mary Andrews with the Parent Information Center, and joining us today, we have Joyce Leatherbury and Jalee Pernol from the Delaware Department of Education. Throughout the year, the Delaware Department of Education hosts a number of meetings for families, caregivers, community members, professionals, and advocates to provide feedback on the state performance measures as mandated under IDEA. Parents, community members, and other stakeholders are essential in approving systems and outcomes for children in Delaware. The Department of Education is hosting a number of upcoming sessions providing an overview of each indicator with opportunities for families to make recommendations to the state on their policies, procedures, and practices. Today, we will review and discuss indicators 3 and 17. There will also be an opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback. So now, with that being said, I will turn it over to Joyce and Jalee. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joyce Leatherbury, and Jalee and I will be discussing indicators 3 and 17. We want to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn, and your input is so very important to us. So I'm going to start out on the next slide by giving you a description of today's agenda to kind of let you know what we're going to do. So we'll start out by giving you a little bit of information about the annual performance report, and then Jalee will take over and discuss indicators 3, which is assessment, and indicator 17, which is our state systemic improvement plan for early literacy. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the state annual performance report. On the next slide. Yep, there we go. So each year, so the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, requires that each state develop a state performance plan or annual performance report, which is our SPP APR, and that this actually evaluates our state's efforts for improvement with the requirements and the purposes of the IDEA. And because this will actually rate how our state will improve the performance of our students with disabilities, as well as the implementation. So the annual performance report is submitted every year to the U.S. Department of Education, and it has 17 indicators. And these indicators look at, again, how the state of Delaware is making improvements with outcomes for students with disabilities as well as their families. Some of the indicators range anywhere from the graduation rate, so the number of students that graduate with disabilities, the dropout rate. We look at our state assessment, which we'll talk about today, but we also look at things such as what environment students are placed in. And by that, I mean like their least restrictive environment. And then we also look at the parent involvement survey that is sent out to all families. So those are just a few of our indicators that we measure. And then lastly, the state performance plan, which we are required to submit every 6 years. So that's just a little bit of information. And as I mentioned today, we're going to talk about indicators 3 and 17. So now I'm going to hand it over to my teammate, Jalee.
Thanks, Joyce. Hi, everybody. Thank you for participating in this. As Joyce said, your feedback is critical to the work that we do. And we know that looking at the whole child that we can't make any gains or progress without having not only parent feedback on some of these indicators, but also just your participation in the whole process. So we thank you very much for your time. So on the next slide, you can go ahead to, thank you. So as Joyce said, indicator 3 is about the state assessment, and there are subparts to this indicator, but for each of them, we are reporting out on reading and math, and we are required to report out on the data for grades 4, 8, and then high school. And you will see when we break down some of the data in graphs and charts that we got a waiver for the school year 2019-2020 because of COVID, that we were not required to report out on our state testing data because of the pandemic. So you will notice that as we go forward. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about the first subpart of indicator 3, which is participation. So that's how many students with disabilities were eligible to take that test, that did take that test. And you can see, well, I'll describe the charts for you a little bit in the beginning, because the setup of the charts is similar going forward. The top chart is ELA, the bottom chart is math, and then we have it chunked. So each of those 3 bars is, the first one would be 4th grade, the middle is 8th, and then the far one on the right is high school. And then the years are green is 2018, blue is 2019, and then the yellow gold is high school.
So, Jay, would you mind if I interject for a second? I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to also point out that when we say the state test, that we're talking about the Smarter Balance test for grades 4 and 8. And then for high school, we're talking about the SAT. And then we have our students that take the alternate assessment in 4, 8 in high school. So I just wanted to give that clarification.
Thank you, Joyce.
No problem.
So you can see, looking at this chart, that the gold bars are lower because last year was, a difficult year, still being impacted by the pandemic, that our participation rate was significantly lower than previous years. And a lot of that was because, of virtual settings, etc. So the next slide shows you the numerical values of that, which I know can be a little overwhelming. So the top one is looking at 4th grade ELA and math, and then it's the middle is 8th grade and high school. And as Joyce said, we have to create a package for the federal government, which says going forward, we're going to have this baseline to go from, and we're going to set targets so that we can measure our growth and to see how we are progressing. And for indicator 3 for participation, we are able from the government to set our target at 95. Obviously we couldn't go higher than 100. And we have been using 95 as our target previously, and we are proposing to continue with the target of 95. We are also looking for most of these sub-targets to have a baseline year of 2018. And that was because, again, with the pandemic, et cetera, we were trying to find a good year that we felt before COVID started to play with our data, that we could use that as a starting point. So we're looking at 2018 as our baseline and proposing that our targets be 95% for participation going forward. So on the next slide, we are seeking some of your feedback about the data, or if you were to have any suggestions or questions about the participation rate. And this is a time where if you wanted to comment now, that's great. If you want to write in the chat, that is available too. And then we will also send out a survey later to ask you these same questions. And the survey includes these data charts. So please don't feel like you need to memorize all these numbers, because that would be a little overwhelming. So whatever is easiest for you and makes sense to get your feedback, we are happy to take it. And of course, we'll have our information at the end of this. So if you wanted to reach out to us individually, we are happy to take individual emails as well. And if no one has anything to comment right now at this time or in this type of format, we will move on because we value your time and appreciate you continuing on with this webinar. So the next slide is going to talk about indicator 3B, which is looking at the proficiency rate on the standard assessment. So this is how, when Joyce mentioned 4th grade and 8th grade, it's the Smarter Balance Assessment, and for high school, it's the SAT. And we're looking at how students with disabilities in grades 4, 8, and high school scored proficient on those assessments. And last year again was not a great year data-wise, but that was because we had such a significant decrease in the amount of participation. So the next slide breaks it down numerically, and I will try to explain it so that it's not overwhelming with all these numbers. But the left-hand side is ELA, the right-hand side is math. And again, we need to set targets for how we're going to gradually improve this data over time. And what we have done is ESSA has recommended that we aim for 50% proficiency rate by the year 2030. So we are proposing that if they would like us to hit a 50% proficiency rate by 2030, we have set our targets accordingly, that if we aim for that goal, that these are what our targets would need to be going forward in this package to achieve that.
Can I add a comment too? So just to kind of explain a little bit further for those that may not know. So when we talk about proficiency rate on the assessment, that would be the scores range from a 1 to a 4, with 4 being the highest rating that you can get. So students that receive either a 3 or the 4 on the state assessment as far as Smarter Balance. And I think that was, and then also as far as the, when Jalee explained about the 50% being proficient, that would be, so 50% of students with disability are proficient on the state test in math and ELA.
Correct. Thank you, Joyce. So on the next slide, we're seeking your feedback on the help with proficiency rates for the regular assessments of Smarter and the SAT. If you have any suggestions for how schools can work on improving those scores, or if you had any comments or questions about the data related to this. And again, feel free to respond in whatever way works best for you or that you're comfortable with. And if no one jumps on this quickly, then we'll just go ahead and we'll move to the next slide, which is looking at the alternative assessment. So these are the students that, because of their disability, the regular Smarter Balance or SAT would not be appropriate, and they take the alternative assessment, and we're looking at their scores in grades 4, 8, and high school again. I will say the chart looks a little misleading because the yellow on the far right, which is for high school, the top ELA, the bottom math, looks significantly higher than previous years. But that's because the amount of students who took the test that year was so much less than previously that it's not an accurate reflection of overall statewide how students with disabilities are doing on the alternative assessment. So we have to it's not ideal to be with the pandemic and the timing of creating baselines and targets with these last 2 years of data being so out of our norm, but just kind of keep in mind that, you know, it's not an accurate reflection because it's only, you know, about 50% of the students in the state took the assessment, whereas previously, you know, we were in the 90s. So the next slide will show you the numbers related to this sub-indicator. And we are looking to do the same as we did before for the regular assessment. If our goal is to have 50% proficiency by 2030, what would our targets need to be going forward to reach that goal? So that is what we are proposing. And again, using 2018 as our baseline, because we were trying to pick a valid but useful year to base these targets off of, which was pre-pandemic. So the next slide is our typical questions that we've been asking for your feedback and suggestions on how we can approve these scores for the alternative assessment. And again, always, if you have any questions or comments about the data itself, those are welcome also. So the next slide, this is a new sub-indicator. They started it this year, and it's looking at the gap in proficiency. So this is looking at, and we're just looking at the regular standard assessment. So again, Smarter Balance for an 8th grade, and high school would be SAT, because we are comparing how students with disabilities do on this regular assessment compared to all students who took these regular assessments. Obviously, the goal would be to narrow the gap, that students with disabilities should not be doing significantly worse than the general population who's taking these assessments. And again, because we are dealing with the ramifications of a pandemic, it can look a little misleading. It can look like, oh, the gap has narrowed, but the gap narrowed because so few students took the assessment with and without disabilities, and they scored significantly lower than previous years, that the gap looks smaller. So obviously our goal is to have a smaller gap because everyone is doing better, not a smaller gap because everyone scored worse than previously. So just another thing to keep in mind. And the next slide looks at that data numerically, which, thank you. So again, the one side is ELA and the other is math. And what we do have is we have 2 options for how we can set targets for this, because it is a newer subpart of this indicator. We haven't done targets for this before, and we were trying to think about options for what makes sense to best chart our progress and our growth. So the middle charts show if we were to set our targets with a baseline of 2018, and if we set our targets so that the gap would be cut in half by 2030. So if we were to decrease the gap in half by 2030, we would need to be decreasing the gap by those increments in those charts to reach that goal. And then the bottom charts show if we were to have a set amount of 2%. So if we said every year, we will decrease the gap by 2% going forward. I will let you know that when we ran the numbers, there's not a big difference between those two. For decreasing the gap by half, a lot of the difference between the years, like 2.65, 2.34, along those lines, as opposed to the bottom charts, which is 2.00%. So just kind of keep that in mind, that there's not a huge difference between the two, but it's really just what we think and what our stakeholders like you feel is the best way for us to target our growth and report out on said growth. So the next slide alludes to that, where we are, asking your opinion on if you have a preference on which set of targets we would use for this sub-indicator. And then, as always, any questions or comments, especially because this is a new measurement that they're asking us to report on. We greatly appreciate and value input for how we should measure this going forward. So we'll move on to indicator 17, which is very closely related to indicator 3, because it's also looking at the assessment data. Now, the State Systemic Improvement Plan, which is SIP, which is our indicator 17, states were allowed to choose what they wanted for this measurement. And this was a many-year process involving many stakeholders to decide what we in Delaware wanted to measure. And at the time, they decided that they wanted to measure early literacy scores. So this is looking at students with disabilities in 3rd grade. And it gets slightly confusing because whereas indicator 3 that we've been discussing, for the most part, we're looking to increase the amount of students doing well on the assessment, and indicator 17 is the reverse of that. So we're looking to decrease the amount of students not doing well. Same data, but 2 different ways of looking at it. And again, indicator 3, we were looking at 4-8 in high school, and we were looking at reading and math. And indicator 17 is looking at 3rd grade and just reading. So the next slide shows what that data has looked like historically. There hasn't been a whole lot of movement. Based on that and the amount of years that were taken previously and the amount of stakeholder involvement that was engaged in coming up with the original baseline and target setting, we were looking to maintain that trajectory, which is a 2% decrease annually in the amount of students who are not scoring proficient. So if you remember what Joyce said earlier, that would be, we want less students scoring a 1 and 2, like on the Smarter Balance, and more students scoring the 3 and 4 on the Smarter Balance. So if you go to the next slide, again, what our feedback is really, because this is focused very specifically on early literacy, is if the families and community members have any suggestions on how we can continue to work on improving our early literacy data, that's greatly appreciated. And of course, if you have any questions, we're happy to answer those too. So I think that that is pretty much it for us bombarding you with all those charts and numbers. And we know that it's a lot to take in, especially in this short arena, but we are always available to answer questions via email. You could call us at the department. I'm sure if you reached out to Pick could get you in contact with us. We're available right now if you would like to unmute to make any comments or have any questions. And then we'll also send out the survey, which again, we'll have this information for you in the survey. So you can spend some more time maybe digesting it and going over it, and then you could provide your feedback then if you felt like that was more comfortable for you.
We also have a 1-page description as well that can kind of give you a little bit more direct information too, if that is helpful.
Thank you, Joyce and Jalee. What I have been doing is putting these recordings on our website with the survey and the information. So if you do not want to comment here or reach out, you can definitely look for that on our website. It should be up by the end of the week. Thank you both for all of this information. I think it is really great to look at and provide feedback for our parents. If anyone has any questions, we got a few seconds here. Other than that, like I said, the recording will be available by the end of this week. So watch out for that. And thank you so much, both Jalee and Joyce, for taking time out of your day to join us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yes,
and
thank you for having us.
Problem.
yeah, thank you for giving us this platform to be able to reach the audience. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, you guys have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you
Thanks,
too.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.